Everyone was taught that the Roman Empire collapsed because of barbarian invasions from the north. It's a story in every history textbook from America to Europe. In 410 AD, a general named Alaric led his Visigoth army into Rome, burned it, pillaged it, and the so-called Great Empire simply fell apart. The story sounds simple, it sounds reasonable, and it seems to explain everything. When you do this, it doesn't happen overnight. Each emperor told himself, we're only reducing it by 10%. Nobody will notice. But after 70 years, the denarius had lost 95% of its value. A loaf of bread that once cost 1 denarius now cost 20. Meat, triple the price. Rent, 5 times higher. The citizens of Rome weren't living in an empire anymore. They were living through a nightmare of hyperinflation. The Visigoths were Germanic people. They lived in what is now Germany, in the areas around the Black Sea, and in Eastern Europe. They were not primitive. They had organized societies. They had kings. They had laws. They conducted trade. In many ways, they were similar to the societies of the Germanic peoples that we know about from other sources. The Visigoths had a problem, and their problem was the Huns. The Huns were a pastoral people who originated in Central Asia. By the year 350, they had begun migrating westward. They moved into the territories of the Visigoths and pushed them out. The Visigoths, facing this external pressure, needed to relocate. They needed to find new territory. Where could they go? They could go north to Scandinavia, but the climate there was harsh. They could go south toward Rome. In the 4th century, the Roman Empire was still the dominant power in the region, even if it was weakened. The Visigoths began to see Rome as a potential source of refuge. In the year 376, the Visigoth king Fritigern came to the Roman authorities. He did not come as a conqueror. He came as a supplicant. He asked for permission to enter Roman territory. He asked for land where his people could settle. He argued that Rome needed a buffer against the Huns. The Visigoths would settle inside Roman territory and defend the frontier against the Hunnic invasion. The Roman Emperor Valens granted permission. The Visigoths began to cross into Roman territory. But here is where things went wrong. The Roman government was supposed to provide the Visigoths with supplies. They were supposed to help them settle. They were supposed to integrate them into the empire. But the Roman government could not afford to do this. Remember, the currency was still debased. The trade networks were still disrupted. The government's finances were still in chaos. When tens of thousands of Visigoths arrived looking for supplies, the Roman government could not meet the demand. The Visigoths found themselves in Roman territory, but not welcomed, not supported, starving in many cases. The Roman authorities tried to distribute grain to them, but the supplies ran out. There were too many Visigoths and not enough resources. This is where the relationship broke down. The Visigoths, having been promised supplies, found themselves abandoned. They were in a foreign land. They were hungry. They were desperate. Some began to loot villages and farms for supplies. Some began to demand that the Roman government provide what had been promised. The situation deteriorated. There was a massacre of Roman soldiers by some Visigoth groups. There was retaliation. Fritigern, the moderate king who had sought peaceful settlement, was pushed aside by more militant factions. A new leader named Alaric took control. And what happens when inflation becomes that severe? Commerce collapses. People abandon currency and return to barter. They trade wheat directly for oil instead of using money. The military stops getting paid because the money is worthless. When soldiers don't get paid, they start looting. Cities become abandoned. The population drops by 1/3. The infrastructure, those magnificent Roman roads that connected the empire, falls into ruin. Alaric was born around the year 360. He was Roman educated. Some sources suggest he had served in the Roman military. He understood Roman culture and Roman politics. He was not some illiterate barbarian. He was a sophisticated political and military leader. But Alaric inherited a terrible situation. The Visigoths under his leadership were in Roman territory, but not accepted as Romans. They were treated as occupiers, even though they had technically been allowed to enter. They were struggling to survive. The Roman government could not provide what had been promised. Alaric's response was to militarize the Visigoth community. He organized them into a force. He began to march toward Rome itself. His goal was not to destroy Rome. His goal was to extract concessions. He wanted money. He wanted land. He wanted recognition for his people. For several years, Alaric marched up and down the Italian peninsula. He besieged Rome multiple times. Each time, the Roman government agreed to pay him tributes and concessions. But each time, the Roman government could not actually pay because the government's finances were in ruins, because the currency was worthless, because the system had broken down. This went on for years. Alaric would demand payment. The Roman government would promise payment. The Roman government could not deliver. The cycle repeated. By the year 410, Alaric was tired of negotiations. His people were starving. His soldiers had not been paid properly in years. He decided that he would take what Rome could not give him. On the 24th of August, 410 AD, Alaric's forces entered the city of Rome. They did not burn it to the ground. They did not kill everyone. What they did was loot. They took supplies. They took treasure. They took anything of value they could find. Then they left. Alaric marched his army away from Rome and headed south towards Sicily. The historians Zosimus and Orosius documented these events. They describe Alaric as behaving like a legitimate military commander, enforcing payment of a debt, not like a savage invader bent on destruction. They describe Alaric issuing orders to protect temples and religious sanctuaries. They describe Alaric as showing restraint, even as he took what he needed to feed and pay his troops. Some modern historians, like the scholar Michael McCormick at Harvard, have even suggested that Alaric may have viewed himself as a legitimate Roman military commander, enforcing the payroll of his troops. In this interpretation, Alaric was not invading Rome. He was a Roman general collecting payment owed to his soldiers. But the narrative that was taught in schools, the narrative in history textbooks, was different. It was simpler. It was easier to understand. It blamed Alaric. It blamed the Visigoths. It blamed the invaders. It did not blame the Roman government for debasing the currency. It did not blame the Roman system for failing its own people. That's when the Visigoths appeared at the northern border. But they didn't invade out of conquest. They invaded because they needed to escape something worse, the Huns. And when Alaric finally marched into Rome in 410, he wasn't conquering a thriving civilization. He was just delivering the final blow to a corpse. Why? Because that narrative was more comfortable for those in power. If Rome fell because of military invasion, then the lesson is about the external threat. Be wary of outsiders, build stronger walls, maintain military power. But if Rome fell because of internal monetary mismanagement, then the lesson is something else entirely. The lesson is that your own government can destroy your wealth. Your own government can debase your currency. Your own government's mismanagement can bring down an empire. And that is a lesson that makes governments uncomfortable. So we come to the question, why did historians and textbooks get this story so wrong? Why is the fall of Rome universally taught as an invasion narrative rather than a monetary collapse narrative? There are several reasons, and they are worth exploring. First, the invasion narrative is simply easier to tell. It has a hero and a villain. Rome is the hero. Rome is civilized. Rome is sophisticated. The Visigoths are the villains. They are barbarians. They are primitive. They are invaders. This is a simple story. It has clear good guys and bad guys. It is the kind of story that teachers can tell in an hour-long class. It is the kind of story that fits neatly into a textbook chapter. The monetary collapse narrative is far more complex. You have to explain currency. You have to explain debasement. You have to explain inflation. You have to explain why a sophisticated civilization's internal systems can fail. This is not as easy to teach. It requires understanding of economics. It requires understanding of monetary policy. It requires thinking about systemic issues rather than individual actors. This is why textbooks prefer the invasion narrative. It is simpler. It is easier to teach. It fits the time constraints of education. Second, there is a political problem with the monetary collapse narrative. If historians started emphasizing that Rome fell due to currency debasement, what message would that send to the modern world? It would suggest that modern governments are also vulnerable to monetary mismanagement. It would suggest that debasing currency to fund wars or social programs has consequences. It would suggest that the monetary system is fragile and can be destroyed by mismanagement. But your history books don't tell you any of this. They tell you, barbarians invaded Rome. End of story. Mission accomplished. Students remember, barbarians bad, Rome weak. A neat, tidy conclusion. Modern governments do not want that message to get out. Modern governments, particularly the American government, do debase their currency. They print money to fund wars. They print money to fund social programs. If the public understood that the Romans destroyed their empire through the same mechanism, it might create uncomfortable questions about modern policy. So there is a subtle but powerful incentive for textbooks to avoid the monetary collapse narrative. It is not necessarily a conscious conspiracy. It is not like someone sat down and said, let us hide the truth about Rome. Rather, it is a structural issue. The people who write textbooks, the historians who are published, the academics who get tenure, all of these people operate within a system that is not interested in asking uncomfortable questions about government monetary policy. Third, there is a historical bias in how historians approach history. Historians have been trained for centuries to focus on political and military events, kings and battles, invasions and conquests. These are the events that make it into the historical record. These are the events that are documented in primary sources. Monetary policy, on the other hand, is often not well documented in the primary sources that historians use. The Romans did not leave us detailed economic statistics. They did not leave us government budget reports. What they left us was coins. They left us papyri with price records. They left us the writings of historians like Zosimus and Ammianus Marcellinus, who describe the events of their times. Modern historians, using techniques like numismatic analysis and papyrological research, have been able to piece together the story of Rome's monetary collapse. But this is relatively recent scholarship. For centuries, historians did not have these tools. So, for centuries, the invasion narrative was the only narrative that was told. Now we have the tools to tell the real story, but the textbooks have not caught up. The traditional narrative is still taught, the invasion narrative is still emphasized. The monetary collapse narrative is still marginalized. Fourth, there is the simple issue of specialization. Most historians who write general textbooks are not economists. They are not trained in monetary policy. They do not have the background to understand or explain currency debasement. So when they encounter the evidence of Rome's monetary collapse, they do not know how to integrate it into their narrative. It is easier to stick with what they know, political and military history. There is also, it must be said, a nationalist dimension to this. For European and American historians, Rome represents a kind of ancestral civilization. It represents the roots of Western civilization. There is a psychological investment in Rome. When Rome's fall is attributed to external invasion, it becomes a story about noble Romans defending against barbarism. When Rome's fall is attributed to internal monetary mismanagement, it becomes a story about Roman incompetence and failure. It is more comfortable to tell a story about noble ancestors being defeated by external enemies than to tell a story about ancestors destroying themselves through mismanagement. But history does not care about our comfort. History cares about truth. They don't tell you that the denarius dropped from 50% silver to 5% silver. The truth is that Rome fell primarily due to internal monetary collapse, not external invasion. The truth is that the debasement of the denarius destroyed the empire's economic system. The truth is that currency mismanagement led to hyperinflation, which led to the collapse of trade, which led to the collapse of cities, which led to the collapse of military organization, which led to the collapse of the central government. The invasion of the Visigoths did not cause this collapse. The invasion happened because the empire had already collapsed. The Visigoths were not the cause of Rome's fall. They were a symptom of it. Now here's the part that matters. Here's the part that is not ancient history. Here's the part that is about you right now in 2024. The pattern that destroyed Rome is not unique to Rome. This pattern has repeated itself throughout history. Every time a government decides to solve its financial problems by debasing currency or printing money, the same pattern emerges. The consequences are always similar. Let us look at Weimar Germany. After World War I, Germany was forced to pay enormous war reparations. The Treaty of Versailles demanded that Germany pay 200 billion marks in compensation. This was an impossible sum. Germany did not have that much money. The government could not raise it through taxation. The public simply did not have the resources. So, what did the German government do? It printed money. It printed marks. It printed lots of marks. The idea was that if they printed enough money, they could pay the reparations. They could pay the debts. They could solve the problem. For a while, this seemed to work. There was more money in circulation. The government could pay its bills. But as more and more marks entered circulation, the value of the mark plummeted. Prices began to rise. Prices rose faster and faster. Eventually, prices rose almost hourly. By the year 1923, hyperinflation had taken hold. A loaf of bread that cost 1 mark in 1922 cost 200 billion marks in 1923. It is hard to even comprehend numbers that large. Families who had saved their entire lives saw their life savings become worthless in the span of months. The political consequence of this was the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. People were desperate. People were angry. The existing government had failed them. They were willing to turn to an authoritarian figure who promised to make them great again. The rest, as they say, is history. Now let us look at Zimbabwe. Robert Mugabe became president of Zimbabwe in 1980. For decades, his government was stable enough. But in the early 2000s, Mugabe decided to seize white-owned farms and redistribute them to black farmers. This was politically popular, but economically disastrous. The farms became unproductive. The government's revenues fell. Mugabe had a problem. They don't tell you about inflation reaching 1,000%. So what did his government do? It printed money. The Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe began printing Zimbabwean dollars. It printed more and more of them. At first, this seemed to solve the problem. There was money available for spending, but the inflation accelerated. Prices began to double every few days. By 2008, the Zimbabwean dollar had become virtually worthless. Workers would receive their monthly wages in stacks of cash that could not even buy a bottle of milk. By 2009, the government gave up. It abandoned the Zimbabwean dollar entirely and began using the US dollar as its currency. The human cost was staggering. People's life savings evaporated. People who had worked for decades found that their pensions could not buy a week's worth of food. The economy collapsed. People began to starve. There was a cholera epidemic. Over 300,000 people died. This is what hyperinflation does. It destroys societies. It destroys people's ability to plan for the future. It destroys the savings of ordinary people while the wealthy protect themselves through ownership of real assets. Now we come to the present day. The United States has a national debt of over $33 trillion. The interest on this debt is over $600 billion per year and rising. The government collects roughly $4 trillion in taxes per year. After interest payments and essential services, there is little money left for anything else. The government is in a similar position to the Roman Empire. It needs money, and it does not have it. What is the government doing? It is printing money. The Federal Reserve has expanded the money supply by trillions of dollars in recent years. This has happened both through traditional quantitative easing programs and through direct spending programs by Congress. The result is that there is more dollars in circulation than ever before. Inflation has responded accordingly. Inflation in the U.S. reached levels not seen in 40 years. Prices for housing, for food, for energy, all increased dramatically between 2021 and 2023. Now, it is true that U.S. inflation has not reached the hyperinflationary levels seen in Weimar or Zimbabwe. This is because the U.S. still benefits from the dollar being the world's reserve currency. This gives the U.S. some protection against hyperinflation, at least for now. But the mechanism is identical. The government is printing money to solve financial problems. Inflation is rising as a result. Ordinary people's purchasing power is declining. Here is the pattern that connects Rome to Weimar, to Zimbabwe, to America. 1. A government faces a financial crisis. It cannot meet its obligations through taxation. They don't tell you that international trade simply stopped. 2. The government decides to print money to solve the crisis. They tell themselves it is temporary. They tell themselves it is necessary. They tell themselves it will work. 3. For a while, printing money does seem to work. There is more money available. Bills get paid. The crisis seems averted. 4. But as more and more money enters circulation, prices begin to rise. The purchasing power of the currency begins to decline. 5. As prices rise, people demand more money for the same goods. Prices accelerate. Inflation becomes entrenched. 6. The government tries to contain inflation, but it is difficult. They have printed so much money that it is hard to reverse. If they reduce the money supply too quickly, the economy crashes. 7. Ordinary people suffer. Their savings lose value. Their wages do not keep up with prices. The social contract breaks down. People become angry and desperate. 8. In the worst cases, society breaks down. In Rome, the central government lost control. In Weimar, people turned to Hitler. In Zimbabwe, people abandoned the currency entirely. The question is not whether this pattern is real. History has proven it is real. The question is where America is in this pattern. We are clearly in stages 2 and 3. The government is printing money. For now. Seems to be working. But are we approaching stage 4? Are prices about to accelerate? Or are we already in stage 4? Have inflation already begun to accelerate? These are not rhetorical questions. These are questions with real implications for your life. Let us look at the specific evidence that proves Rome's currency collapsed. This is important because some might argue that the decline of Rome was primarily military or political. But the numismatic and papyrological evidence is overwhelming. They don't tell you that armies without paychecks became roaming bands of thieves. First, the silver content data. The Roman mint kept records of the coins it produced. These records were lost over time, but modern numismatists have been able to analyze surviving coins using neutron activation analysis and other scientific techniques. The results are definitive. In the year 200 AD, under the Emperor Septimius Severus, the denarius contained approximately 50% silver. Sometimes it contained as much as 55%. The coin was genuinely a silver coin. By the year 215 AD, under Caracalla, the denarius contained approximately 43% silver. This was a reduction of about 8% in 15 years. By the year 235 AD, under Severus Alexander, the denarius contained approximately 30% silver. By the year 250 AD, under Philip the Arab, the denarius contained approximately 5% silver. Some sources say even less. By the year 270 AD, under Claudius Gothicus, the denarius contained as little as 3 to 5% silver. The vast majority of the coin was copper or other base metals. This is not a matter of interpretation. This is measurable scientific fact. The coins themselves tell the story. You can take a Roman denarius from the year 200 and compare it to a denarius from the year 270. You can see the difference. The older coin is clearly more silver in color. The newer coin is clearly more copper in color. The sources for this data come from multiple places. The numismatic analysis is well documented in academic journals. There is a book called The Roman Imperial Coinage by Harold Mattingly and others that catalogs and analyzes coins from this period. There are PhD dissertations from universities like the University of Cambridge and the University of Oxford that have analyzed the silver content of Roman coins. All of them reach the same conclusion. The denarius was systematically debased from about 60 to 95% over the course of 70 years. Second, the price data. The papyrologist Peter Temin at MIT analyzed price records from Roman Egypt. These records were written on papyri, which are preserved in the dry Egyptian climate. They provide us with actual transaction records from the period. They don't tell you that the collapse took 80 years, step by step. Currency debasement by currency debasement. These records show the prices of various commodities: wheat, lentils, oil, barley, chickpeas, and others. By looking at these prices over time, we can track inflation. In the year 200 AD, a single artaba of wheat, which is about 39 liters, cost approximately 200 drachmas in Egypt. The drachma was Egypt's currency, used alongside the denarius in transactions. In the year 230, the same artaba of wheat cost approximately 400 drachmas. That is a 100% increase in price in just 30 years. In the year 250, the same artaba of wheat cost approximately 1,000 drachmas. That is a fivefold increase in price from the year 200. In the year 260, the same artaba of wheat cost approximately 2,000 drachmas. In the year 270, the same artaba of wheat cost approximately 3,000 drachmas. That is a 15-fold increase in price in just 70 years. Similar patterns are visible for other commodities. Lentils show a 6-fold price increase from year 200 to year 270. Oil shows a 7-fold increase. Chickpeas show an 8-fold increase. These are not estimates. These are prices recorded in actual transactions. The papyri that document these prices are preserved in museums around the world. The British Museum has some. The Metropolitan Museum in New York has some. The Louvre in Paris has some. The University of Michigan has some. Any scholar can go to these museums and examine these papyri. They can see the prices written in ancient Greek. They can verify the dates. They can confirm that prices increased roughly 15-fold over 70 years, which corresponds almost perfectly with the decrease in silver content of the currency. Third, the population and settlement data. Archaeologists have studied the patterns of human settlement in the Roman Empire during this period. They have analyzed written sources and archaeological evidence. They have looked at burial records, construction records, economic records, and other indicators of population. They tell you, barbarians invaded, Rome fell. The consensus among archaeologists is that the population of the Roman Empire declined by somewhere between 20 and 40% between the year 200 and the year 300. In some regions, the decline was even steeper. The number of inhabited settlements also declined. The scholar Chris Wickham at Oxford University published research showing that the number of occupied settlements in Europe declined by approximately 30 to 40% during this period. Why would settlements be abandoned? The reasons would be economic failure. When people cannot make a living in a particular place, they move. When the currency is worthless, trade is disrupted, agriculture becomes difficult, and the economic base of a settlement disappears, people relocate. This is exactly what we see in the archaeological record. The settlements that were abandoned were concentrated in areas that depended on trade and monetary commerce. The settlements in more remote rural areas were more likely to survive. This matches the theory of monetary collapse perfectly. When the monetary system fails, trade-dependent settlements fail. Rural, subsistence-based settlements can survive on barter and local exchange. But settlements that depend on long-distance trade and currency-based commerce collapse. Fourth, there is the literary evidence. The ancient historians Ammianus Marcellinus and Zosimus both wrote about the economic problems of Rome in the 3rd and 4th centuries. Ammianus Marcellinus wrote about the failure of the military to maintain order. He wrote about the lack of resources. He wrote about the desperation of the people. Zosimus wrote specifically about currency issues. He described how the denarius became increasingly worthless. He described how merchants refused to accept the imperial currency at face value. He described how people turned to barter instead of using money. The Roman Emperor Diocletian himself issued an edict in the year 291 called the Edict on Maximum Prices. This edict tried to fix the prices of goods throughout the empire. It was an attempt to control inflation by law. The edict listed hundreds of items and their maximum prices. A pound of beef could not cost more than 8 denarii. A pound of pork could not cost more than 12 denarii. A pound of cheese could not cost more than 6 denarii. Various vegetables and grains had maximum prices. Even luxury items like wine and perfume had maximum prices. The edict threatened severe punishment for violations. Anyone caught charging more than the maximum price would be executed. It was a desperate measure by the emperor to try to control the uncontrollable. But it's wrong. Why? Because that's an easy story to tell. Because it doesn't threaten any current political system. But if your history textbook started saying, a monetary system destroyed an empire from within, then people would start asking uncomfortable questions. They'd start wondering, what could happen to our currency? Did it work? No. You cannot fix hyperinflation by decree. You cannot control the market by threatening people with death. The edict was largely ignored. Merchants would not sell at the maximum prices because they would lose money. Either goods disappeared from the market entirely, or people sold them underground at higher prices, or people simply refused to use the denarius and went back to barter. The fact that Diocletian felt the need to issue this edict, and the fact that it failed, tells us everything we need to know about the state of the Roman economy in the late 3rd century. The currency was worthless. Inflation was rampant. The government was desperate and out of options. All of this evidence, taken together, paints a clear picture. Rome's currency was systematically debased for 70 years. This caused catastrophic inflation. Prices increased 15-fold. Trade collapsed. The population declined. Settlements were abandoned. The military fell apart. The government lost control. This is not interpretation. This is not speculation. This is evidence-based historical analysis. What lessons can we draw from this history? What value does understanding Rome's monetary collapse provide? The first and most obvious lesson is that monetary systems can fail. Money is not magic. Currency is not inherently valuable. Money has value because people believe it has value. Once that belief disappears, money becomes worthless. And when money becomes worthless, it can destroy entire civilizations. This might sound obvious, but it is actually profound. We live in a world where currency is not backed by anything physical. There is no gold standard. There is no silver backing. A dollar bill is literally just a piece of paper. It has value only because the government says it does and because you believe it does. If that belief breaks down, if people stop believing that the dollar has value, then the dollar becomes worthless. Not gradually, but potentially very quickly. This happened in Zimbabwe. This happened in Venezuela. This is not theoretical. This is something that has actually occurred in the modern world. The second lesson is that debasement of currency is a form of taxation. When the government prints money or debases currency, it is not creating wealth from nothing. It is transferring wealth from you to whoever receives the new money first. Usually, that is the government and the wealthy connected to the government. Think about it this way. Suppose you have saved $1,000. You have worked hard for years to accumulate this wealth. Then the government prints $1,000 of new money and puts it into circulation. Prices increase because there is more money chasing the same amount of goods. And governments don't want people thinking about that. Your $1,000, which used to buy a certain amount of goods, now buys less. Your wealth has been reduced in real terms. Where did that wealth go? It went to the government and to whoever received the new money first. The newly printed money could be spent before prices adjusted upward, so the people who received it first got the benefit. This is regressive taxation. It hits the poor and the middle class the hardest because they hold their wealth in cash. The wealthy can protect themselves through ownership of real assets, land, property, stocks, commodities. The third lesson is that governments are incentivized to debase currency. When a government faces a financial crisis, it is tempting to print money. You get the immediate benefit of additional spending power. You can pay your bills. You can fund wars. You can buy political support through spending programs. The costs come later. The inflation comes later. The economic disruption comes later. The social breakdown comes later. By that time, the politicians who made the decision might be out of office. They might even be blamed for the problems they created. This is why debasement happens repeatedly throughout history. It is not because governments are stupid. It is because it is politically convenient. The short-term benefits outweigh the long-term costs from the perspective of whoever makes the decision. Rome's emperors were not trying to destroy their empire. They were trying to solve immediate problems. They needed money for the military. They needed to prevent a rebellion. They needed to respond to a crisis. So they debased the currency. It worked in the short term. But in the long term, it destroyed the empire. The fourth lesson is that the consequences of monetary collapse are not evenly distributed. When the monetary system breaks down, some people suffer and some people are protected. The wealthy who own land and property are protected. They can always feed themselves from their land. They can always find value in their possessions. The poor who depend on wages and savings are devastated. When prices skyrocket, they cannot afford food. When their savings become worthless, they lose everything they have accumulated. This is why hyperinflation leads to social breakdown. It destroys the middle class. It creates desperation. People become willing to turn to extreme solutions. They become susceptible to authoritarian leaders who promise to fix the problem. So the narrative gets changed. The real story gets buried. And in this video, we're going to unearth it. We're going to trace the denarius from 50% silver down to 5%. We're going to meet each emperor, each decision, each consequence. We're going to understand why the Roman Empire really collapsed. Not from conquest from the outside, but from self-destruction from within. The fifth lesson is that the narrative we tell about history shapes how we understand the present. For centuries, the fall of Rome was blamed on barbarian invasion. This narrative was comforting for those in power. It suggested that threats came from the outside. It suggested that we need strong walls and strong military forces to protect ourselves. But the real story is about internal monetary mismanagement. That narrative is uncomfortable for those in power. It suggests that government monetary policy can destroy societies. It suggests that we should be concerned about our own government's monetary decisions. Is it possible that the reason the invasion narrative was emphasized and the monetary collapse narrative was buried is precisely because the monetary collapse narrative is threatening to those in power? The sixth lesson is about the importance of understanding economic history. Most people do not understand how currency works. Most people do not understand the mechanisms of inflation. Most people do not understand how government monetary policy affects their lives. This is a problem. When people do not understand something, they are vulnerable to manipulation. They are vulnerable to false explanations. They are vulnerable to propaganda. If most people understood that Rome fell due to currency debasement, they might start asking uncomfortable questions about modern monetary policy. They might start asking why their government is printing money. They might start asking whether the same fate could befall their own country. By keeping people ignorant about economic history, those in power maintain power. But by learning about this history, you gain the power to understand what is happening to you. You gain the power to make informed decisions about your money and your future. The seventh lesson is about resilience. The fall of Rome was not a sudden event. It did not happen overnight. It took 70 years. At any point during those 70 years, the empire could have stopped the debasement. An emperor could have said, "We need to stop this madness. We need to return to sound currency." But they did not. Each emperor continued the pattern. Each emperor kicked the can down the road. At any point in this process, society could have adapted. But instead, society broke down gradually. The monetary system failed, and society failed with it. The lesson here is about the importance of facing hard truths early. If Rome had admitted in the year 220 that it had a currency problem, it could have done something about it. But instead, the problem was denied. It was minimized. It was allowed to grow worse and worse until it was too late. And here's the critical part. We're going to compare it to right now. To your currency, to rising national debt, to inflation eating into your purchasing power, to a system that might be following the exact same pattern. In the present day, we need to ask ourselves, are we in a similar situation? Is our monetary system sustainable, or are we denying a problem that will eventually force itself upon us? These are not simple questions. They do not have simple answers. But they are important questions to ask. So let us recap what we have learned. You were taught that the Roman Empire fell because of barbarian invasion, that Rome was conquered from the outside by the Visigoths and other Germanic peoples. But the truth is far more complex. Rome did not fall because of external conquest. Rome fell because the Roman government systematically destroyed its own currency. The denarius dropped from 50% silver to 5% silver over 70 years. Prices increased 15-fold. Trade collapsed. The military fell apart. The government lost authority. By the time Alaric and his Visigoths arrived at the gates of Rome, the empire had already destroyed itself. The Visigoth invasion was not the cause of Rome's fall. It was a symptom of it. It was the final blow delivered to a civilization that had already committed suicide through monetary mismanagement. This is not ancient history. This is not an obscure academic debate. This is a lesson that echoes across time. Every time a government has debased its currency, the same pattern has emerged. Weimar Germany printed marks and created hyperinflation. Zimbabwe printed dollars and created hyperinflation. Venezuela printed bolivars and created hyperinflation. Each time ordinary people suffered. Each time the social order broke down. Each time people lost everything. Now the question is, will the United States follow the same path? The government is printing money. The national debt is soaring. Inflation is rising. Are we at the beginning of this pattern or somewhere in the middle of it? I cannot predict the future. No one can. But I can tell you this. Understanding history gives you the ability to prepare. Understanding what happened to Rome gives you the ability to ask questions about your own country. Understanding monetary collapse gives you the tools to protect yourself and your family. So I'm warning you now. If you want a comfortable story about evil barbarians and weak Romans, then stop watching. But if you want the truth, if you want to know what textbooks don't teach you, then stay with us. The most important lesson is this one. Money is power. Control of the money supply is control of civilization. The people who create money have power. The people who simply accept whatever money is given to them are powerless. When Rome's emperors debased the currency, they were exercising power. They were deciding who benefited and who suffered. The wealthy benefited because they could protect themselves in real assets. The poor suffered because they had nothing but currency. In the modern world, the same dynamic exists. When the government prints money, it benefits those who are closest to the government. It benefits the financial system that has access to newly printed money. It benefits those who own real assets. It hurts those who hold cash. It hurts ordinary workers whose wages do not keep up with inflation. It hurts savers. Understanding this is the first step to protecting yourself. Understanding the mechanisms of monetary policy is the first step to understanding power. Understanding history is the first step to understanding the future. So what should you do with this knowledge? First, educate yourself. Do not just accept what you are told. Learn about monetary policy. Learn about inflation. Learn about currency. Read about the history of money. Read about what happened in other countries when their currencies failed. Second, protect yourself. If you believe that currency debasement is happening, you might consider diversifying your wealth. Real assets, like property or commodities, historically perform better during periods of inflation. Hard assets, like gold or silver, have historically maintained value during monetary crises. Third, ask questions. When your government announces new monetary policies, ask yourself, who benefits from this? Who suffers? What might the long-term consequences be? And finally, tell others. Share this story. Tell people what really happened to Rome. Tell them about the monetary collapse that destroyed an empire. Tell them about the pattern that has repeated throughout history. Tell them about the implications for today. Because a society that understands history is better prepared for the future. A society that understands how currency can be destroyed is less likely to allow its currency to be destroyed. A society that understands monetary policy is less vulnerable to manipulation and control. Because what comes next will change how you see empires forever. This video is called The True Origin of the Fall of Rome. But it is not really about Rome. It is about you. It is about your money. It is about your future. It is about your ability to maintain the wealth you have worked so hard to accumulate. Rome had the choice to stop debasing its currency. The emperors chose not to. They continued down a path that led to the destruction of their civilization. You have the choice to understand what happened and to act accordingly. You have the choice to educate yourself about monetary policy. You have the choice to protect yourself. You have the choice to demand better from your government. Whether you make those choices is up to you. If you found this breakdown valuable, please subscribe and hit the notification bell. We are covering more historical events through the lens of economics and monetary policy. The French Revolution was not about liberty, it was about bankruptcy. World War I was not about nationalism, it was about debt and currency collapse. The Great Depression was not an accident, it was caused by Federal Reserve policy. These stories connect to each other, they form a pattern. And understanding that pattern is essential if you want to understand the world you are living in. Thank you for watching. I will see you in the next one. Before you go, I want to ask you to do two things. First, in the comments below, I want you to leave one word. Just one word. Tell me. Empire or dollar? Empire if you think we should be terrified about what happens when currency collapses. Dollar if you are already terrified about the currency you are using today. Leave your answer now. I will feature my favorite responses in the next video. Second, if this video made you think, if it challenged what you thought you knew about history, I want you to share it. Send it to a friend. Post it on social media. Start a conversation about this. The best way to understand these ideas is to discuss them. The best way to preserve this knowledge is to spread it. Before we go further, I have one quick question for you in the comments. Thank you for watching. History matters, currency matters, your future matters. Drop just one word right now. Empire or dollar? Empire if you think we should be terrified about what happens when currency collapses. Dollar if you're already terrified about the currency you're using today. Leave your answer in the comments right now. I'll feature my favorite responses in the next video. Not just wrong about the details, wrong about the entire framework. It's wrong because the people who wrote your textbooks chose to emphasize what was easy to tell, and they buried what was difficult to explain. And we're about to discover what really happened. It's not a story about military conquest. It's not a story about invasion. It's a story about something far more terrifying. It's a story about currency. Before we understand how Rome fell, we need to understand what Rome looked like when it was at the top. Because the empire that collapsed was not weak. It was not primitive. It was not primitive. It was, in many ways, the most sophisticated civilization the world had ever seen. In the year 200 AD, the Roman Empire was at its absolute peak. The reign of Septimius Severus marked a moment of extraordinary power and stability. The empire stretched across 5 million square kilometers. It touched 3 continents, Britannia in the northwest. The Rhine and Danube rivers formed the northern frontier, defended by 300,000 soldiers. The borders extended all the way to Mesopotamia in the east, where Rome constantly clashed with the Parthian Empire. To the south, North Africa was under complete Roman control. Egypt was a jewel in the crown, producing wheat that fed the entire Mediterranean. The population of the empire stood at approximately 70 million people. This was before the age of nation-states, before the age of nationalism. Yet Rome had created something unprecedented, a unified political and economic system that spanned from the Atlantic to the Persian Gulf. Trade routes connected Rome to India, to China, to places Romans would never visit but did business with nonetheless. The military was the backbone of this system. 400,000 soldiers stood on the frontiers and in the cities. They were paid regularly. They were well equipped. They were feared. The legions were not just a military force. They were a symbol of Roman civilization itself. A soldier in Rome's army had status. He had income. He had purpose. And all of this was held together by currency. By the denarius. The denarius was a silver coin, roughly the size of a dime. When you held it in your hand, it felt real. It was real. It contained roughly 45 to 50% pure silver, sometimes more. It had been the standard currency of Rome for over 300 years, and by 200 AD, it was the most trusted currency in the world. Merchants in Egypt wanted denarii. Traders in Britannia wanted denarii. People in Syria and Judea and North Africa all wanted denarii. Why? Because the denarius had value, real value, not theoretical value, not imaginary value, real silver value. If you held a denarius, you could take it anywhere in the empire and people would accept it. Better yet, you could take it outside the empire and it would still be accepted. The denarius was the global currency of the ancient world. It was what every currency wanted to be. A laborer could earn 1 denarius per day. With that denarius, he could buy a loaf of bread, or a jug of cheap wine, or supplies for his family. The currency was stable, predictable. You knew that next month, a denarius would still buy roughly the same amount of bread. That stability is what made commerce possible. The empire's economy was thriving. The port of Alexandria in Egypt was one of the busiest trading centers in the world. The roads were paved. The aqueducts brought fresh water to cities. A merchant could travel from one end of the empire to another and do business using the same currency. This had never existed before in human history. To understand the fall of Rome, you don't need to understand armies or warfare. You need to understand monetary policy. You need to understand that when an emperor begins reducing the precious metal content in his currency to fund wars, he isn't just creating inflation. He's destroying society from the inside. But there was a problem. There always is. The cost of maintaining this empire was staggering. The military alone consumed 60% of the imperial budget. 400,000 soldiers needed to be paid, fed, and equipped. They needed weapons. They needed armor. They needed horses. The logistics of it all were mind-boggling. Beyond the military, there was administration. Rome had created a bureaucracy to manage this vast territory. Tax collectors, governors, military commanders, civil servants, all of them needed to be paid. And then there were the public works. The roads had to be maintained, the aqueducts had to be maintained, the cities had to be maintained, and on top of all of that, there were the constant wars. The northern frontier was never entirely peaceful. The Parthian Empire in the east was constantly trying to expand. There were rebellions to put down. There were tribal groups that needed to be suppressed. Every few years, the emperor would launch a military campaign that cost enormous sums of money. By 200 AD, the empire was already running up against the limits of what taxation could provide. The Roman system relied on land taxes, commercial taxes, and tribute from conquered territories. There was only so much money to extract. The territories were already heavily taxed. The merchants were already paying substantial duties. The emperor, Septimius Severus, faced a decision that would echo through the next 70 years. The military wanted more money. The frontier needed more troops. There were campaigns to fund. The tax system could not keep up with the demands. What do you do when you need money and you cannot get it through taxation? In the modern world, governments borrow money. They issue bonds, they borrow from other countries or from international institutions. But Rome did not have those options. Rome had something else instead. Rome had the power to create money. Or more accurately, Rome had the power to create a specific kind of money, currency backed by precious metals. The denarius was supposed to contain a certain amount of silver. That amount guaranteed its value. But what if you reduced the amount of silver? What if you reduced it just slightly, so slightly that most people would not notice? That is the choice Septimius Severus made. And that is where the real story of Rome's fall begins. Let us walk through this, step by step. Because what happens next is not a sudden collapse. It is not a one-time event. It is a slow, deliberate, catastrophic erosion of the foundations of an entire civilization. By the year 200 AD, the Roman Empire sat at the peak of its power. It stretched from Scotland to Mesopotamia. Population, 70 million people. Military, 400,000 soldiers. Currency, the denarius. A silver coin whose value was recognized across the entire ancient world. One denarius could buy you a loaf of bread, or a full day's wages from a laborer. It was the gold standard of the ancient world. Everyone trusted it. Everyone wanted it. The year is 215 AD. Septimius Severus is dead. His son Caracalla is now emperor. Caracalla is fighting a war against the Parthian Empire to the east. The war is expensive. The military demands more money. Caracalla needs a solution. He calls the imperial mint. He gives an order. Reduce the silver content of the denarius. Not by half, just by a little. Reduce it from 50% silver to 43% silver. Replace the silver with copper. Most people will not notice. The coin will still look like a denarius. It will still feel roughly the same in your hand. But it will contain 7% less silver. This simple act has a profound consequence. Caracalla has just created more money without actually producing anything of value. Before, 100 denarii would have 50 kilograms of silver. Now 100 denarii contains only 43 kilograms of silver. The amount of silver in circulation has not changed, but the number of coins in circulation has increased. There is more money chasing the same amount of goods. But here is the genius of the strategy, if we can call it that. The inflation does not happen immediately. It takes time for prices to adjust. The population does not immediately understand that their currency is worth less. For a few years, the system seems to work fine. The emperor has more money to spend. The military gets paid. Prices remain roughly stable. This pattern repeats with every emperor that follows Caracalla. Each emperor faces the same choice. Each emperor needs money. Each emperor opts for the same solution. Debase the currency slightly. Most people will not notice. The war effort gets funded. The military gets paid. For a few years, everything seems fine. Let us trace this through the decades. Caracalla reduces it to 43%. Elagabal reduces it to 34%. Severus Alexander reduces it to 30%. In the year 235, we reach what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century. This is not a political crisis, although there is political chaos. This is not a military crisis, although there is military chaos. This is a currency crisis. Between the years 235 and 284, Rome goes through 50 different emperors in 50 years. In other words, the average emperor rules for 1 year. This is chaos. This is political instability on an unimaginable scale. But what is driving this chaos? What is causing this constant churn of emperors? It is the need for money. Each emperor who takes power immediately faces the same problem. The military demands payment. The empire is vast and expensive, and the treasury is depleted. Each emperor tries to solve this problem the same way, debase the currency further. So the debasement accelerates. Each emperor reduces the silver content more aggressively than the last emperor. 50% becomes 43%. 43 becomes 30. 30 becomes 20. 20 becomes 10. 10 becomes 5. By the year 270, the denarius contains approximately 5% silver. 95% of what was once a silver coin is now copper or other base metals. Let me repeat that, because it is important. 95% of its value has been removed. But then something changed. The ancient historian Ammianus Marcellinus documented this. He wrote about how merchants in Rome would refuse to accept the imperial currency at face value. They knew what was happening. They could see it with their own eyes. A coin that was supposed to be silver had turned the color of copper. The numbers tell the story even more clearly. A denarius that had contained approximately 50 grams of silver in the year 200 now contained approximately 2.5 grams of silver by the year 270. That is not a minor reduction. That is a 95% reduction in the actual precious metal content. The imperial government tried to hide this. They tried to convince people that the coin still had value. They issued edicts claiming that the denarius was worth what it had always been worth. They threatened people with severe punishment if they refused to accept the debased currency at face value. But the market does not care about edicts. The market does not care about threats. The market understands value, and the market understood that Rome's currency had become worthless. The mechanism of how this worked is important to understand. When you reduce the precious metal content of a currency, you are creating what modern economists call the Gresham's Law effect. Gresham's Law states that bad money drives out good money. In other words, if you have two coins that are supposed to be worth the same amount, but one is made of more precious metal than the other, people will start hoarding the good coin. They will only spend the bad coin. In Rome's case, old denarii from earlier centuries were worth more. They contained more silver. So people started hoarding the old coins. They only spent the new debased coins. This meant that the new coins, the ones the emperor was creating in massive quantities, were the ones circulating. The old coins disappeared from circulation because people held on to them. This happened across the entire economy. Every merchant understood what was happening. Every merchant started charging more. Because if you are a merchant and someone hands you 10 denarii in payment, and those denarii contain 10 times less silver than they used to, then you need to demand 10 times more denarii for the same goods. This is where inflation comes from. Not from some mystical force, not from merchants being greedy, not from consumers demanding too much. Inflation comes from the currency being debased. It comes from more and more units of currency chasing the same amount of goods. The historian Peter Temmin, writing at MIT, studied the price records from Roman Egypt that have survived to this day. These records were written on papyri and preserved in the desert. They show us, with remarkable precision, what happened to prices over these 70 years. In the year 200 AD, the price of wheat in Egypt was recorded at 200 drachmas per artaba, where an artaba is a unit of grain roughly equivalent to 39 liters. By the year 230, the same amount of wheat cost 400 drachmas. That is a doubling of price in 30 years. By the year 260, the same amount of wheat cost 1,000 drachmas. The price had quintupled in 60 years. From 200 AD to 270 AD, just 70 years, the Roman Empire collapsed. Not from full-scale invasion, but from something much more subtle and much more devastating, catastrophic currency debasement. An emperor named Caracalla started the process by reducing the silver content in the denarius from 50% down to 43%. He did this to fund his military campaigns, and it worked, temporarily. He had more money. But then the next emperor did the same thing, 50% down to 35%. By the year 270, the same amount of wheat cost 3,000 drachmas. The price had increased by a factor of 15 in just 70 years. These are not small changes. These are not minor fluctuations. This is the wholesale destruction of the purchasing power of money. The price of lentils, documented in the same papyri, shows a similar pattern. The price of oil, the price of barley, the price of chickpeas, all of them follow the exact same trajectory. As the denarius is debased, prices increase. As more and more debased currency enters circulation, people demand more of it for the same goods. But here is where it gets even more troubling. The prices did not increase evenly across society. The wealthy were often protected. They owned land, they owned property, they owned the means of production. Their wealth was not denominated in currency. Their wealth was in tangible assets. The poor, on the other hand, held their wealth in currency. They had no land to fall back on. They had no property. They had only whatever money they had in their pockets. As that money became worth less and less, their entire life savings evaporated. Imagine you had saved up 1,000 denarii over your entire lifetime. You worked for decades to accumulate this wealth. By the year 200, this 1,000 denarii could buy you 10 years of food and shelter. By the year 270, the same 1,000 denarii could buy you only a few months of food and shelter. Your life savings, in real terms, had lost 90% of its value. This is not a theoretical problem. This is not an academic exercise. This is the destruction of people's lives. This is why the 3rd century became such a period of social chaos. The social contract broke down. People no longer trusted the system. People no longer believed that working and saving would improve their lives. By the year 250, something remarkable happened. Commerce, the lifeblood of the Roman economy, began to shut down. Merchants stopped using the denarius entirely. They went back to barter. They exchanged goods directly. A farmer would trade wheat for oil. A cloth maker would trade fabric for wine. Money, in many areas of the empire, simply ceased to function. The historian Peter Brown documented this in his work on late antiquity. The shift from monetary economy to barter economy happened gradually over several decades, but by the middle of the 3rd century, it was well established in many regions. The denarius still theoretically circulated, but it was not trusted. People did not want it. They preferred to exchange goods directly. What does this mean for an empire that is built on long-distance trade? It means the empire is collapsing. The roads that once connected Rome to Egypt to Britannia, the trade routes that once allowed merchants to buy and sell across the known world, these began to fall apart. Not because they were destroyed. Not because barbarians burned them down, but because no one was using them anymore. Commerce had stopped. Then the next one, 35 down to 25%, then 25 down to 15%, then 15 down to 5%. Consider what this meant for the military. The Roman legions were stationed far from Rome. They were in Britannia, they were in Mesopotamia, they were on the Rhine, they were on the Danube. These soldiers were not conscripts. They were professionals. They expected to be paid, but how do you pay an army when your currency is worthless? The imperial government tried to meet the payroll, but the salaries they were offering were in increasingly worthless denarii. A soldier who once earned 1 denarius per day could no longer feed his family on that salary. The purchasing power had evaporated. The historian Sabine McCormack studied the military records from the 3rd century. She found that by the year 260, many legions were only receiving partial payment. Some legions were receiving half their expected wages. Some legions were receiving a quarter of their expected wages. And some legions were receiving nothing at all. What happens when you stop paying professional soldiers? They stop serving. They start looking for other ways to survive. They start looting. They start stealing. They start extorting money from civilians. This is not a failure of military discipline. This is not a question of soldiers being disloyal. This is the inevitable consequence of a monetary system collapsing. When your government can no longer pay you with currency that has value, you must find another way to survive. The archaeological record shows us what this looked like. In the areas where the Roman military was stationed, there is a sudden increase in burned buildings, destroyed settlements, and evidence of violence. Not from external invasion, but from internal collapse. Soldiers, unpaid and desperate, began preying on the population. The historian David Mattingly studied the archaeological evidence from Britain. He found that in the middle of the 3rd century, many Roman military camps were abandoned. Not because barbarians attacked them, but because there was no one left to maintain them. The soldiers had left. Some went back to Rome. Some went south to find better opportunities. Some simply faded away into the general population. Meanwhile, the cities themselves were suffering. The Roman Empire had invested heavily in urban centers. Roads connected them. Aqueducts brought water. Markets traded goods. By the year 200, Rome had created a network of several hundred cities across the empire, each one a center of commerce and culture. But these cities were dependent on the empire's monetary system. They were dependent on trade. When trade stopped, when the monetary system collapsed, the cities began to fail. The population could not be fed. The infrastructure could not be maintained. People began to leave. The city of Rome itself, which had housed over 1 million people in the 2nd century, saw its population decline dramatically. By the year 300, it had fallen to perhaps 500,000. By the year 400, it had fallen to 100,000. People were leaving the cities and returning to the countryside. Do you see what's happening here? Every single emperor faced the same problem. They needed money, and every single emperor solved it the same way. They printed more. Or in Rome's case, they literally debased the currency by mixing less and less silver into the coins. When people left cities, what happened to all the urban infrastructure? What happened to the public buildings? What happened to the amphitheaters and the bathhouses and the libraries? They fell into disrepair. No one was maintaining them. No one had the resources to maintain them. Archaeology shows us this too. The archaeological record from the 3rd century is one of gradual decline. Not dramatic destruction, not sudden collapse, but gradual, relentless decline. Building after building was abandoned. Street after street fell into ruin. Entire neighborhoods and once thriving cities simply ceased to exist. The scholar Chris Wickham at Oxford University analyzed the settlement patterns across Europe during this period. He found that the number of occupied settlements dropped by approximately 30 to 40% between the year 200 and the year 300. Towns and villages that had been inhabited for centuries were simply abandoned. Why? Not because of invasion, but because the monetary system that had supported these settlements had collapsed. The markets that had fed these towns no longer existed. The roads that had connected them had fallen into disrepair. The currency that had allowed trade to function had become worthless. This is the period that historians call the Third Century Crisis. And now you understand that this crisis was not a political crisis or a military crisis. It was a monetary crisis. It was the inevitable result of decades of currency debasement. By the year 280, the Roman Empire was not destroyed, but it was fundamentally broken. The trade networks had collapsed, the cities had depopulated, the military had fractured into regional commands that were barely under imperial control. The central government in Rome was struggling to maintain any authority whatsoever. The empire would be reorganized under the Emperor Diocletian. He would divide it into 4 regions, each ruled by a separate emperor. But even with this reorganization, the fundamental problems remained. The currency was still worthless. Trade was still disrupted. The infrastructure was still failing. This was the state of the empire when Alaric and his Visigoths appeared on the northern frontier. This was the empire that he would eventually march into. Now, let us address the elephant in the room. If the Roman Empire had collapsed due to internal monetary failure, why did the Visigoths invade? Who were these people that we have all been taught to think of as barbarian invaders? The truth is far more complicated than the textbooks suggest.